Well, good evening, everyone, and great pleasure to be here and have the opportunity to talk to those of you, I assume everyone is associated with the Bartlett or UCL in some way, so it's a privilege for me to be here and have the opportunity to talk to you. The subject is the National Infrastructure Commission. There are one or two people in the audience who are fully familiar with it and with its history and how it came about. There may be one or two of you who are not so familiar with how it actually came about. So just a little bit of history. As was just mentioned, I was involved with the delivery of the infrastructure for the Olympics in 2012. And when people say to you, well, why was that a success? One of the reasons I always used to give was that very unusually, there was a political consensus around the need for it, and more importantly, having won it, that we were going to be successful in putting on the Olympics. So post the Olympics, it was in fact, oh gosh, oops, sorry, my bag. Post the Olympics, Ed Bors, who was the Shadow Chancellor at the time, said to me, John, what can we learn from that? And can we apply any of this learning from the Olympics to infrastructure in general? And his very words were, what can we do to stop the flip-flopping of political policy around infrastructure? And could you go away and give some thought to this and produce a report for us? So I did that with a number of colleagues from industry, including Andrew Adonis, who's now chairman of the commission, and produced a report which recommended the creation of an infrastructure commission. Went further, it produced a draft bill for establishing the commission and set out in considerable detail how the commission would work. Received full support from the Labour Party and silence from the Conservative Party, who were the government. And in the run-up to the 2015 election, the Labour Party said, well, when we win, we will introduce the Infrastructure Commission. Well, of course, as you all know, they did not win. And so post that election, one assumed, well, that's probably, that's the end of the discussion about an Infrastructure Commission. But I wasn't the only one who was saying this. Many other people have said it for many years, including the Institution of Civil Engineers, who've recommended this sort of concept for a very long time, I think, Peter. And concurrent with the work that I was doing, LSE also produced a report on how the economy should grow. And in that, they raised the whole issue of infrastructure planning and said there needed to be a more coherent approach to it. So lo and behold, in October, I think it was September, October of 2015, after the May election, the Conservatives suddenly announced that they were going to have an infrastructure commission. I would call it, in terms of the way it operates, slightly commission light compared with the particular proposals that we made in my report. But then the Conservatives, with my report, said, well, it all seems a bit clunky, John. So they saw my approach to the decision-making process as being a bit heavy. The one we've got, frankly, the one we've got puts the government far more in direct control, whereas the one we were proposing would have required a more parliamentary consensual agreement. But never mind, we are where we are, and we've made some progress in having a commission. So basically, this is the commission, and a charter was produced for it by the government, in which they set out what the objectives should be, which is to support sustainable economic growth across all regions of the UK, to improve competitive and improve quality of life of the citizens of the UK. It's all pretty obvious things that you would expect infrastructure to be achieving. In terms of the Commission, we were to achieve this by assessing the infrastructure needs of the country, carrying out in-depth studies into the UK's most pressing infrastructure challenges, and the emphasis there is on most pressing. So we're doing two things already. We're doing long-term assessment, which was always the original idea, but more pressing challenges, of course, enables politicians to ask you to do short-term pieces of work so that they can produce something next week and show everybody that they're doing things. And then make recommendations to the government on these short-term pieces of work and equally the long-term. We have to produce a report every 5 years. So every 5 years, we have to do a 30-year sort of tour de horizon and say, well, this is what we think is going to be required over the next 30 years in infrastructure terms. And that is passed to the Chancellor of the Exchequer. So we come under Treasury in terms of government departments. And then he has to respond within 6 months to our recommendations, and if he disagrees with the recommendations, set out why he disagrees and what alternative ideas he may have. That, as I say, we have to do every 5 years. Every year, we're required to produce a report which says how we think the government is doing, and what progress is being made on the different recommendations which we've made along the way. So where are we at the moment? Well, we've been established formally, and this only happened in January. In January, there was the formal establishment of the Commission as a government agency. Bit of a debate about that, because originally it was meant to be a statutory body. Statutory bodies have a certain greater degree of independence, arguably, than a government agency, because a government agency can be closed down next week. If government so feels. A statutory body has got to go back to Parliament, and there's got to be an argument and debate as to whether it's the right thing, and you need another Act of Parliament to get rid of it. So that was one of the first issue for people in sort of criticising the way it's been set up. But I mean, I'm fairly philosophical about these things. My argument is, well, at the end of the day, the most important thing is whether the government takes any notice of you. And it can take no notice of you if you're a statutory body. So frankly, whether you're a statutory body or a government agency, the more important thing is how it actually operates and the degree to which government responds to you. When it was established, we were immediately asked to do 2 reports by the following March, March being budget time. So we were given basically 3 or 4 months to produce 2 reports, one on Crossrail 2. It wasn't quite defined like that. It was what needs to be done to improve the connectivity across London, which was code for Crossrail 2. And then the other one was what should be done to improve energy security and supply. Just a little subject, to cover in 3 months. Anyway, we produced a report the following March on energy security and supply, which fundamentally was a report which focused on what we described as smart energy. So it was very much about smart systems, smart distribution, and looking forward to smarter technologies in the future. We were also asked to do a report on the northern cities and the connectivity across the north of England, linking in, of course, with the government and George Osborne's interest in the Northern Powerhouse and how do you enable the Northern Powerhouse. And so northern city connectivity was another one which we produced. Most recently, we produced the first stage of a report on the linkage between Oxford, Cambridge, Milton Keynes, a corridor which has always been criticised for being a poor cross-country corridor in the UK. And we're still working on that and producing a final report in probably about a year's time, actually. So we're doing a lot more detailed work on that. In the meantime, the Department of Transport has rushed off and said, right, we're going to have a competition to build a private railway. So they've already accepted the principles of our report, which was that the rail line between Oxford and Cambridge needed to be put in place. I mean, at the moment, it's a sort of an itty-bitty thing which takes forever. So we said you need a proper railway between the 3 towns and also an expressway. But most importantly, is the issue of housing. And so we've also talked about how you deal with housing along this corridor, because if you talk to people in Oxford and Cambridge, they're more concerned about a shortage of housing actually than they are about a shortage of a railway or a road to get to the other university. And so in this second phase of the work, we'll be looking at how best to integrate infrastructure and housing settlements along that corridor. And then we were also asked to do a piece of work on 5G, and so that was really setting out what the government needed to do, what the pressures would be for 5G, what other technologies, what other sectors would be very dependent on 5G before very long. It means spending quite a lot of money basically on more holes in the ground. Putting the cables, it's cable capacity that you need, and that at the end of the day is not so much about the technology. It's more about having the facilities under the roads to actually lay the fibre cables to enable the vast degree of data which will flow through as a consequence of 5G. I've gone the wrong way, I think. I'm holding it upside down, that's why. The process and the methodology which we're adopting for the large piece of work, the 30-year piece of work, and indeed for the shorter-term pieces of work, we've adopted similar methodology, but this is fundamentally about the National Infrastructure Assessment, which is this 30-year look forward. I mean, it's all fairly logical, I suppose. I mean, the methodology is pretty clear. You develop a series of scenarios. You do a lot of quantitative modelling. You try and capture all the different expertise and opinions, some of which will be in this room. You do social research into the social issues which are driving the changes in society over the next 30 years. And you look at what's happening in the devolved nations, you look at what's happening and what the plans are in the different regions around the country, and you try and take all these things into account and knit it all together. And then you've got these cross-cutting issues, which again are fairly straightforward. The funding and the financing, the resilience of the infrastructure, the different appraisal methodologies, the government and decision making particularly in the regions and how you're going to achieve that. You've got the whole issue of local growth and geography, sustainability, of course, and how does all of this fit into Britain's obligations to the Paris Agreement and other accords. So how do we do all this in a reduce carbon at the same time? And you do it across those key sectors. You'll see that housing isn't there. And we've had sort of ongoing debates with government as to whether housing is infrastructure or not. Government basically chooses to say it isn't. Frankly, the reason I think they choose to say it isn't is because it's so politically charged. And in a way, central government doesn't want to be seen as being imposing too many decisions around housing. It would much rather these decisions were made locally. So local politicians can take the blame and not central. But of course, we keep on saying to them, you can't separate these issues. Housing is going to be absolutely fundamental. So I think housing will inevitably creep in around the back door, as it were, to the work which we do. We have a high-level timetable for this. Right, what's happened here? That's right. For the work, we're coming up fairly soon to probably by about June. We will be ready to produce what we see as being a vision statement about how we see infrastructure in 2030. So not going into all the detail, but basically setting out the vision. And the priorities that we see for 2050. And then we'll carry on for another year producing more detailed work through to 2018. The reason it's 2018, probably the middle of 2018, the autumn of 2018, is there's an election in 2019. And so the government again wants a report on the table that it can respond to and make part of its election manifesto in 2020. Assuming that we haven't had an election in the next couple of months. Assuming that we stick to the current timetable, that's why we're working to these particular dates. We went through a consultation period at the beginning, and we talked to people about how we were going to do it. And so we said, do you agree that this is the right approach that we're going to be taking? And we got obviously a lot of, about 200 people responded to that with views and on whether it was the right way to go about it. We then called for evidence, and many people put forward their ideas and their views on what should be done. We've been holding expert panels and workshops. I was up in Birmingham last week where we had people from all over the country coming together to talk about transport in isolation. Prior to that, we'd had one on energy. Next week, I'm in Belfast where we'll be getting the Northern Ireland view of the world and what they see as being their priorities. Somebody said to me, "Why are you bothering to go, John? They haven't got a government at the moment." But anyway, it's we'll obviously meet all the people in the different sectors and the civil servants and everybody else, even if there isn't anybody who's currently can claim to be the government of Northern Ireland. Public engagement is the trickiest part of all of this, really, because how do you get to engage with the public as opposed with the informed people who are part of the infrastructure world, and that's something which I think in a way we're still frankly struggling with as to how do you do that. And the difficulty with when you go out to the public, because I discovered when I was working on the Airport Commission, is the only people who turn up are the people who are have strong views, either totally opposed to what you're thinking about doing, or in fact for some other reason totally supportive. But in both cases, you almost have to sort of recognise that you are getting a fairly particular view, and not necessarily the view of the man in the street. Because I think at the end of the day, the success of this is that fundamentally politicians are only going to go ahead with things which they think they can get through. And that means that they need to feel that the public are by and large going to be supportive of the things which have to be done. And so part of our role, everybody who's involved in infrastructure, I think, is trying to find different ways in which we can help the public understand what the issues are, the options, the challenges, the sort of what's the consequence of doing nothing. What would you rather do? I was doing a piece with the CPRE, who I don't have any particular gripes with the CPRE, but on the radio yesterday morning, they said, well, of course, you can see that since 1924, every piece of road expansion has led to more traffic, so road expansion is a bad thing. It didn't require me to point out to them that, well, therefore, would you like the road system in the UK to be the one that we had in 1924, and where might we be if that were the case? But there will always be opposition, and finding the right arguments to get around that are going to be very important. I'm now going to talk about a similar piece of work which the Institution of Civil Engineers did in 15-16 when I was president, and because it's very similar to the work which is being done by the Commission. We did it in a year in the ICE. The Commission is spending 2 years, so the Commission is going to be able to go into more detail. The Commission's got 35 full-time staff. It's got a budget of 10 million, not the sort of resources which we had at the ICE. But on the other hand, the ICE was doing the same thing. It was looking forward to 2050. So I thought I'd run through this just to show you the sort of the considerations which went into that piece of work, the demand drivers, which are going to be exactly the same, frankly, that we use at the Commission, and some of the things which came out of that ICE piece of work. So classic drivers, and these would be the same drivers pretty well whichever Western country, indeed whichever developing country you were in almost. Particularly the aging population one is the challenge for Western countries. The population growth, the urbanization, continued urbanization of countries. You have to look at the different economic trends. You create different scenarios according to high, low, medium growth, and which ones you're going to take. How do you deal with climate change, and what are the impacts of climate change, not only in terms of what legislation are you working to, but equally just simply what is climate change doing, for example, to to storms and rainfall and the impact on flooding and flood defense. And then the one which people always say is the most challenging, which is how do you deal with the rate of technological change, and do you make decisions on infrastructure, which actually, with the speed of technological change that we're seeing at the moment, you've got this dilemma of infrastructure taking sort of typically 15 to 20 years to put anything of insignificance in, from the time you say that's what we're going to do to the time somebody cuts the tape. And in the meantime, the technology could have changed radically, and your infrastructure could almost be out of date by the time you build it. And that's a particular challenge which one has to recognize. I mean, some of the headlines which come out of some of those questions, well, in the UK, a median forecast is a 75 million population by 2015. The OECD is actually forecasting 80 million as its forecast. So whatever way you look at it, likely to be very significant population growth. The GDP up to 3.7 trillion. That's basically roughly a 50% increase. It's about 2 trillion today. So, well, actually closer to a doubling of GDP by 2050. But of course, that's only a relatively small percentage growth per annum. Energy demand. Energy is probably the most challenging of all. Energy demand increase potentially of 50% by 2050. Road congestion continuing to have a significant negative impact on the economy. 900 million a year, I mean, it's not very much money these days, 900 million. But certainly that is a minimum needing to be spent to control flood risk, and I would argue probably you need to spend more than that. 300,000 houses, I mean, you'll hear all sorts of figures banded around, but certainly somewhere between 200 and 300,000 homes being needed to be built every year for the foreseeable future. And then this issue of how do you pay for this, when in fact 2/3 of the infrastructure in the UK is actually provided by the private sector, not by the public sector. We as the Infrastructure Commission have what's called a fiscal remit. And the fiscal remit is that we can assume, or should assume, that the government's willing to spend up to about 2% of GDP on infrastructure. But of course what it means by that is the 2% contribution it's making to road and rail fundamentally, and flood relief, because the rest of the finance for infrastructure is going to come from the private sector. Then the most challenging issue, which is interdependencies. Easy to talk about, far more difficult to analyze and understand and deal with, particularly when infrastructure is largely dealt with in a series of silos through different government departments, interfacing with different regulators into the different private sectors, and none of them really looking at what the other is up to, and particularly focused on their particular stream of infrastructure. But if we're going to reduce carbon, and if we're going to get down to the sort of levels that we're planning by 2050, then we have to electrify heat and transport. Now, electrification of heat is probably a bigger issue than the electrification of transport. But both of those two are clearly going to put enormous demands on our need for electricity if we're going to do that. Big data and digital comms, further demand on energy and electrical demand. One thing which I didn't know until getting into this, cooling water for our power stations accounts for 28% of the abstraction from our rivers. So an interface there between water supply and power. And then, of course, as we get into the ability to actually manage demand in these different sectors, it shouldn't only be about supply. A lot of this has to be about how do we manage demand and reduce the need for different aspects of infrastructure. The use of SUDs, just not on a grand scale. This is using civil engineering technology at a lower scale, but sustainable drainage systems can in fact reduce the need for wastewater treatment, and again an interface between two different sectors. And then of course we have to remember this 300,000 however many 200,000 homes a year. It's all going to place more demand on all infrastructure. So everything else increases with that population increase, and housing. One of the challenges with housing, there's loads of land out there. CPRE report produced about a week ago. I was surprised. Only 8.9% of England, forget Scotland and Wales, England, only 8.9% is actually built on, including the back gardens, including the public parks. And so when you're looking at where housing is likely to be, yes, there's loads of land out there, but most of it's in the wrong place. And it's not where people are going to want to live, and it's not going to have the infrastructure connected to it. And so the interface between infrastructure and housing is always going to be critical. And then, of course, autonomous vehicles creates another whole series of pressures for us, both in terms of digital capability. You can't have autonomous vehicles without 5G. And again, of course, a further increase in electricity demand. So just some of the issues which you can see coming along. So it's half an hour is over. Remind you of that, which is our program. As you can see, government response to in the budget of 19, which will be the autumn of, get it right, it'll be the autumn of 19, because budgets in the future will only be in the autumn, not in March. And that gives them 6 months to respond before an election in May 2020. So it's 7 o'clock, so I'll stop there and we'll get on to the bit you really want to do, which is talk about it rather than listen to me. Thank you.
Yeah, I would like to ask a question.
Yes.
How would you define infrastructure?
Well, conventionally, we define it in those sort of half a dozen key sectors of energy, transport, water, waste, digital. What's the other one I've missed out? Flood, I expect. Flood management. So those are the conventional 6. The one which is, in a sense, has been coming up on the rails in the last few years, of course, is digital. And almost the impact that's having on all the others, and the impact that's having on our ability to potentially manage demand in all the others. So smart technology has the potential to enable us through consumers to actually influence the demand for this. I mean, I haven't talked about road pricing, but I mean, road pricing is one of the issues which we put on the table in our ICE report last year. We didn't use the word road pricing. I think we used some euphemism for road pricing, but it was pretty clear to everybody that's what we were talking about. And it's interesting, I was in with Treasury last week with the First Secretary, in other words, number 2 to the Chancellor. And there is clearly a willingness for government to see the Commission as an organisation which, because it's independent, can actually bring these issues out and put them on the table. Government isn't saying, well, in that case, we'll take them up, but they're quite happy for the Commission to sort of bring out some of these rather more controversial issues and get them out on the table for discussion, even though they might say, well, thanks very much, Commission, but we're not going down that line for the time being. But what is interesting on how we pay for our roads is that in 2020, vehicle excise duty, the road tax that we pay, is going to be hypothecated. Now, this in itself is really unusual for the government to actually take a tax and hypothecate it to a specific part of society, and indeed the part of society, if you like, which has paid the tax in the first place. So a direct link between you pay your road tax and that money is going to go into the road network. And part of the thinking behind that, I'm sure, is that it's starting to get us as motorists used to the idea that there's a link between what we pay and the road condition and the road capacity that is made available for us, which of course is a first step towards a much more detailed approach to pay as you go, if you like, with your car according to the time of day, what type of road you're using and so on, and a much more detailed road pricing mechanism, which modern technology will enable in a way which 20 years ago would have been impossible.
Thank you. Alex?
Thank you very much. Very clear presentation. I want to mention 2 words that I'm surprised you haven't used yet, which is risk and uncertainty. You'll have to forgive the economist in me.
Yep.
And that's particularly important for the National Infrastructure Commission because your view of the future is very long term.
Yep.
So really, it's commonly said beyond sort of 5-10 years,
yep,
risk falls away and you're in a world of pure uncertainty.
Yep.
I'm keen to know what the National Infrastructure Commission, how do they draw that line between what is risky and can be estimated and probabilities attached and what is clearly very uncertain and you build into your scenarios? And just briefly, is there anything that you're taking from the Macpherson review on government modelling and the relatively recently published Aqua book on how to model risk and uncertainty?
Yeah, I mean, in fact, we've just published a paper on economic modelling for comment. So a position paper, I think it was called, which has fundamentally been put together by Bridget Rosewell and Tim Besley. And so they've sort of put down everything they can see on this very issue and then put it out and said, well, come on, guys, tell us what you think and what are the issues with how we model some of these economic forecasts, model risks, and how do you deal with them. I've been saying in the last few weeks that I think I can see that the way that we present this at the end of the day is a sort of almost a short, medium, long. That we need to find a way of presenting this which looks at what are the key issues which can be addressed and around which there's greater certainty, and therefore the solutions might be clearer in, say, the next 10 to 15 years than what happens between 15 and sort of 25, and then what do we see beyond that. Because I think we're going to, in a way, need to present it in that way almost for politicians to take it. Because if all we did was say, well, this is the future, guys, in 2050, politicians will turn off, frankly, because their world doesn't exist in those sort of terms. So I think we've almost got to give them a stepladder of how we get from where we are today to there. And of course, as you say, the risk becomes greater as you go along. I mean, it's no different, though, having said that, to the challenges that we had with airport capacity in the southeast. What was interesting there was we couldn't really get any of the airlines to tell us how they saw the future beyond 2040. What was driving them was, in a sense, they've just ordered a load of airplanes. So for them, that's the technology, and they're going to have 20 years life out of those planes, maybe 25 years life out of those planes. So that is their business model. And so saying, well, how do you see aviation in 2040? They would say, well, we don't really know, because we don't know what the capability of the planes is going to be in 2040. And if they are very different, then you go into this whole need for a hub or not, or a low cost point to point. And our challenge, and our challenge as the Commission was really, where did we put our money? Now, we put it on continued need for hubs, but I mean, I accept that, there were others out there who would say, well, you're wrong, because by the time we get to 2050, point-to-point low cost will be the way of the future, and therefore the need for hubs will be less. But there was nobody really out there who had any evidence to put their money on that and say that was going to be the answer. So we took the punt on hubs. But I mean, the risk is, frankly, at the end of the day, you've got to take risks with these issues because of the difficulty of significant infrastructure, and you've just got to accept that you are going to get some decisions wrong because of this long time frame, getting from concept through to final delivery, with the whole planning processes, the design process, and everything else that goes with it. I totally accept your point. I haven't caught up with Macpherson. I'll have to look that one up.
Okay, thank you, Peter Hansford.
Thanks very much.
Peter.
John, I'm interested, does the Commission have a role in looking at the capacity to fund the infrastructure we need, and also the industry's capacity to deliver the infrastructure that we need?
Yes, I think we have to do both. One of the points I keep on making is that I think that we should not be seen as an organisation which is simply going to talk about miles of concrete or asphalt, or miles of capability for digital. It's not just about projects. I think a lot of what we have to say will be about policy, and and by policy very much, well, what are the policies which are going to enable financing to be made available? And to what extent is the regulatory regime that we've got in different sectors imposing on that and stopping that at the moment? Last week I went up to Wakefield. I was asked to go up and cut the tape on a mini hydro scheme on the River Calder, which was only 500 kilowatt scheme. It provides enough electricity for 800 homes, cost £5.5 million, totally provided by they were there, half a dozen high net worth individuals who got sufficient money that they were prepared to sort of just lob their money into the pot and say, here you are, here's my million, let's go and build a turbine in the Calder and produce some electricity. And they were able to do that because the government was willing to set the tariff for that electricity, the TIF as it's called, at 12p a kilowatt when they made those decisions to invest. It's now reduced it to 6. So they were saying to me, forget the next one, John. We'd love to do another one. In fact, we could do loads of these all over the country, but at 6p a kilowatt, it doesn't work. And so the government sort of immediately is chopping off that opportunity for, it's just a very simple axial turbine which will run for 100 years, basically. Or the turbine will probably need to be replaced, but all the civil engineering, which is where the money is, goes into this thing. That'll last for 100 years. You'll change the turbine maybe 2 or 3 times in that 100 years, but basically you've got pretty well free electricity for 100 years. But the driver is this issue of the financing and then the funding. So I think as a commission, for me, financing and funding is going to be absolutely central to what we have to say, and skills is another one, because the ability of us at the end of the day to deliver this is going to depend on the skills in the country to actually design and build the infrastructure which is required.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. So just to kind of develop on that question a little bit, I think you've talked a lot about what we need to deliver and why we need to deliver it, but just a bit more on kind of how we're actually going to deliver this if we're facing like a skills shortage. So how can professionals in this day and age kind of go out there and drive really efficient infrastructure delivery? And is there any tools that the National Infrastructure Commission are kind of developing to kind of aid with that? So you currently have things like the NEC 4 and that, but what's next in the pipeline, or is there anything?
I would argue that is not the NIC's role. I would say that is I'll get it right now, the Infrastructure Authority, keep on changing its name, but the thank you, IPA, the Infrastructure Projects Authority. So our role is to identify what needs to be done. How you physically deliver it, for example, at the end of the day, I think is very much a role for the IPA. The challenges for the industry don't go away, and the biggest challenge is productivity. If you haven't already seen it, McKinsey published a report about 3 weeks ago, which is an interesting, quite a short report, but looks at the issue of productivity, not only in the UK construction sector, engineering sector, but across the world, and does comparisons of what's changed in productivity around the world over the last 20 years or so. And the interesting thing is that in that period, the UK has only changed by about 1% per annum productivity growth, whereas general manufacturing and industry has grown at sort of 3 to 4% during that same period. America's actually gone backwards. American productivity in the construction sector is less today than it was 20 years ago. And the country which has the highest productivity, in fact, is Belgium, which I found quite fascinating. But then last night I was talking to somebody who was explaining to me that there are some very, very good factories, for example, in Belgium at the moment, which are precasting complete walls for houses, including the windows and everything else, and they're building their houses in no time at all using these sort of very high quality modular systems. I mean, one of the potential upsides of Brexit, of course, is that if in fact we are going to see a shortage of skilled labour, or more difficult to obtain the skilled labour that we need in the UK, the unemployment rate in the UK is not going to solve that problem, as there aren't enough unemployed people to train to meet the demands of the construction sector. So in fact, what is needed is for the industry to address a different way of building things and to address this whole issue of modularization, prefabrication, different materials. How do we actually build for less and build more efficiently and build more in factories and not doing everything on site? I'm losing my train for a moment there. The other issue around this is design. Chris Wise at Expedition, and many of you may well know Chris from Arab days and so on. I mean, Chris has recently produced a report in which he says that there are £19 billion of savings to be made in the UK construction industry by a series of, simply by thinking about it differently. And the one which is so easy to remember is he said all we have to do is write into all the codes and standards, design codes and standards, 3 words, and no more. Because we over-design all the time. And you know, it's very easy to just feel comfortable, well, I'll add another 10%. And then the guy who's checking your work, he adds another 10%. And then the third-party checker comes along, he adds another 10%. So before you know where you are, you've got a simple reinforced concrete beam which has probably got 30% more reinforcement in it than it needs to have. And if we could accept that the codes in the first place are safe, they've got factors of safety in, those codes would not be codes unless everybody thought they could be absolutely worked to quite safely. And yet we go further than the codes. And it's just one of the examples that there's a report on, again, if you look it up, I'm sure you'll find it, that Chris Wise has produced. So I think there's a lot which, as an industry, we have a responsibility to actually get down and do, because if we can reduce the cost of what we build, it enables the people who provide the finance to build more. It enables us to actually build more if we're actually reducing the unit cost of everything that we do. And that starts with design. It's by the time you start digging holes in the ground, you're stuffed. You're not going to reduce the cost by the time you start digging holes in the ground. In fact, it's only going to go one way. It's going to get more expensive, because the things you forgot in the design are then going to be revealed as you go along, and so there's far more probability that in fact costs increase once you've started construction than they reduce. So we need to actually be prepared to spend more time at the front end, more time thinking about what we're doing and how we're going to do it, where we're going to do it, and all these questions, and then spend more time getting our design thinking right before we launch off into construction. But the human nature is that everybody wants to get digging as soon as possible, and as soon as you follow that principle, then you're at risk of a less productive outcome.
Thank you. We have another question from Andrew.
Hi, John. Somewhat different question but touching on a number of points that you've made. You mentioned Brexit. If we talk about Trump, who's said that huge opportunity for significant investment in infrastructure in the US. At the moment, this very week, UCL's hosting the UK-China Infrastructure Academy, and Chinese investors are very keen on looking at British opportunities. And we've got a situation at the moment where you've got America saying America infrastructure, but really for America. But there are potentially opportunities for British expertise in the infrastructure world. We might not be brilliant, but we're not bad in some areas. But we've also got the threat or the opportunity to attract a number of different foreign organisations and foreign countries to come in, which America would absolutely say, nationally critical infrastructure, they're not permitted to take ownership. Do you see that the National Infrastructure Commission is going to be involved in that kind of politics, the geopolitics of infrastructure, either acting as a beacon for the opportunities for British industry to go abroad and deploy its expertise, or to actually get involved in the discussion about what level of infrastructure ownership foreign nationals are permitted to have?
Well, it's an interesting question, because I suppose in an entirely sort of logical world, before we started our work, we would have the industrial strategy. And the industrial strategy would be the top line, and then infrastructure strategy would be the next line down. One would follow from the other. So taking your point, what we do in infrastructure would be feeding in and benefiting these sort of core elements of the industrial strategy, which is to improve Britain's competitive, make it available, make it open to people who want to come in, support us with finance. And if Britain went down the Trump route, then God help us. It's I'm very much a believer in open borders and openness to foreign finance. If somebody wants to come and invest their billions in London rather than invest them anywhere else in the world, then why would we want to stop them? And of course, this business of ownership, it's only short term anyway, isn't it? You say, well, we don't want them owning our power station, then you turn around 6 years later, they've sold it anyway. And they may have sold it to somebody from an entirely different part of the world. But the government, we cannot, with our tax system, we cannot afford to do this ourselves. We don't raise enough money to build all these things ourselves. I don't see this country becoming a significantly greater taker of tax, and therefore we will continue to rely on private finance. And as soon as you open yourself to private finance, then the sources of that private finance, I think, could be from anywhere. Trump, I'll be very interested to see whether actually all this infrastructure happens in America. I must say I have reservations as to whether he's going to be able to deliver this, because most of it is not federal investment. Most of it is in the states, the individual states, and therefore whether they're going to be able or willing to do everything that's being promised, I would have reservations about.
Thank you. Have another question?
Right. John, can I ask you about the issue of interdependence that you raised? Yep. You might expect me to ask a question about that. As you know, a number of universities, including this one, have been doing quite a lot of research on that topic over the last 3 or 4 years. There's quite a lot of evidence that shows how valuable it would be were you to treat all those sectoral issues in a system of systems way. I'd like to reflect on 2 things. One, your experience, bearing your blushes, of how successful you were in the ODA in getting everyone round the table to deal with those multi-sectoral issues. I know it was a unique proposition with a well-defined deadline and a well-defined budget, but nevertheless, in governance terms, you had everyone round the table within the envelope of the Olympic Park to deliver what you needed to have delivered to make the Olympics work. You said earlier that the Commission was more about what needed to be done and the IPA was about how to do it. But if you said, these are the things that need to be done and you're going to have to do this in a system of systems way, do you believe the IPA does have the mandate to bang the heads together with the Treasury to get the sectoral divide in departments and the industry to act in a more cohesive way, much as you managed to achieve in the Olympics, or not? Because if not, then we're going to continue to do these things in sub-efficient, sub-effective, siloed ways, which I don't think is in the interest of the country.
No, I don't know. I don't know how you do it, quite frankly.
Oh dear.
Because what you're saying is, what is the decision-making system which is going to align the telecom sector, the rail sector, the road sector, the energy sector, into a recognition of one another's needs, the timetables of one another's needs, and be able to work within a plan which actually reflects those different timetables and needs, when in fact those sectors are all being financed in entirely different ways, and particularly with some of them by private finance and by companies who are raising their finance, the EDFs or whoever, the British Telecoms of this world, and they're having to do it in addition, against the background of a regulator who's telling them, well, you can't do that because that's going to put the price up. And my job as the regulator is to keep the price down. So within our current structure, I don't see how you can do that. You would have to change the structure. You would have, government in some form would have to take more of a central role in seeking to provide more direction and provide that sort of big picture and be saying to guys, to different sectors, look, we want you to take account of this when you're designing this or developing that. We'd like to see this come forward in the next 15 years, not in the next 25 years, and so on. Which, I mean, private finance in infrastructure is a bit of an oxymoron anyway. Because yes, the money is coming from the private sector, but it's only coming against the background of government policy. And so government has an enormous ability to influence the flow of that money by its own approach, directly or through the regulator. And I mean, the regulator basically is not a free agent. He is there to do what government tells him to do. So, so government has the ability to take a much bigger handle, and it could do this through the NIC and the IPA. But the likelihood of it doing so in the short term, I have to say, I think is fairly low. I mean, the classic little example we had on the Olympic Park was that Thames Water had an enormous main which ran right down the western side of the park, an ancient main which was a high-risk main. You know, and so we said to them, look, wouldn't it be good if whilst we've got the site dug up, you came in and put the new main in? You're going to do it sometime in the next 10 years. Why not do it now? So, oh, no, it's not in our program of works, you know, et cetera, we're not going to do it. We haven't got the money allocated for it in the next 2 years, et cetera, et cetera. And literally about, only a month or 2 months before we were about to put this flipping great car park right across the top of this main, it burst. With dire consequences for the area of 500,000 people got no water and all the rest of it. The site was flooded. And so they then come roaring in, caused absolute mayhem, but at least dug the whole thing up and put a new main in. But it was only that crisis which actually caused them to actually come into the time frame that we wanted them to come into.
I mean, it seems to us that crises are what cause people to realise that everything is joined up.
Yeah.
And it sort of seems self-evident to those of us who've been working in this subject that actually being precautionary about that when you put in new infrastructure, that you make it multi-sectoral, is self-evident. Do you think your constitutional structure being an instrument, if I may, of the Treasury rather than of Parliament, because Parliament gets it, because it has cross-party, I just wonder whether although it looks like a nuance, actually it could be quite important in the longer term, because you could go to Parliament and say, convince the government of the day, whatever colour of party that is, that doing this in a more joined up way when it is appropriate to do
I think
is a good idea.
What we're relying on, of course, is that our reports will be totally public, and therefore to that extent every MP can pick them up and can stand up and make a noise about it, and to the degree that Treasury, I mean, a senior I'd say it was Michael Heseltine, who was on the commission, of course, until a couple of weeks ago. And Michael sort of says, well, of course, the only role for Treasury is their role is to stop things happening. And it's, but on the other hand, when we debated the commission in the round 2 or 3 years ago, the conclusion from everybody was the only place that you could put it, given that it had to be sort of within government somewhere, was within Treasury. Because at the end of the day, Treasury is the most powerful organisation, and therefore if we were in the Department for Transport, or if there was a department for the infrastructure or something, it would never have the same degree of influence as it would if it was part of Treasury. And our challenge all the time is going to be how we find that sort of balance between listening in, if you like, we have to sort of, I think the Commission is going to have a deaf ear and an open ear. So on occasions we'll have to have a deaf ear where we don't hear what we're being told, because in a sense that's not what really the right answer should be. On the other hand, if we have totally two deaf ears, we'll just get kicked into touch. So we have got to be, I think, aware of the political nuances of what government is thinking, what ministers are thinking. Because if all we do is serve up reports which are, in a sense, unacceptable, I mean, you would know better than anybody, Peter, I mean, they'll just be put on the back shelf, won't they? Nothing will happen to them. So we've actually got to produce reports which have some chance of seeing the light of day and being picked up by ministers and acting on. And that's why I think all these sort of bodies, you don't sit in a darkened room doing your work and then sort of drop it out at the end of 2 years. There has to be a continuous dialogue going on where you are sort of feeding in, seeing what responses you get to what you're doing, and sort of reading the tea leaves, as we say, to understand how things are going to fall at the end of the day, if you're going to have some chance of them being picked up and used.